and not get up and speak. And I'll just walk you through the ground rules before I introduce my fellow panelists. And you have their bios on the web, both the FCA and the Naval Institute. I'll speak for about 3 minutes just to get you in the mood of misery that this panel's really about. And then I'm going to introduce Admiral Bill Burke, Vice Admiral Burke, who's the DCNO for Warfare Systems and 9, soon to retire, and you can see the gray hair on his head. Major General Karen Dyson, Director of Budgets for the U.S. Army, who I've known for some time and whom I pity. Dr. Eric Labs from the Congressional Budget Office, who's been there quite a few years and acknowledges that he's never, ever had to analyze a mess like this one. And Mr. Jim McAleese, who is a seasoned outside observer of defense budgets and who takes the same view as Mr. Labs. And each of them will speak for about 5 minutes. I just, as I said, I want to lay out some thoughts for you to ponder. After everybody has spoken, we'll throw it immediately open to questions. Let's begin with the fact that we're now about to complete a strategic choices and management review to somehow align strategy to the sequester. This will be our third strategic review in 5 years. The last one was Panetta's pivot to Asia. Before that, we had the Gates review. Actually, before that, we had the QDR, which means that for the rest of the world, they can't figure out what our strategy is because they think we can't figure out what our strategy is. And the fact that we link it to budgets means we can't figure out what our budget horizon is like either. The next fact is that the administration, in its wisdom, decided to submit a budget that's $52 billion above the sequester, and essentially to ask the Congress to decide what the defense budget should look like. Congress has never decided what a defense budget should look like. Eric will correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe if Congress changes 5% of the budget, that's a lot. And so now it's being asked to figure out how to get down $52 billion from where the administration asked it to be. The administration still hasn't provided a number for the Overseas Contingencies Operations account, which I'm sure you'll hear, particularly from General Dyson, has a major impact on how the Army has to figure out where its budgets are going. Then there's the fact that the sequester is not a one-year thing, but essentially a decade sort of thing, but is being treated 1 year at a time, which makes it impossible for planners to figure out anything about the out years. And those of you who've been in this business know that out years don't mean very much to begin with in a normal situation, and here we are in an abnormal situation. And then there are the exemptions from the sequester that make it even harder for people like Admiral Burke and General Dyson to manage budgets, because personnel, MILPERS, is exempted from the sequester. And not only MILPERS. Because of the nature of the law, operations and maintenance allows for money to be moved around because it doesn't have the same restrictions on programs, projects, and activities. What that means is that you can fully fund the Defense Health Program, which has been an entitlement. Well, if you're going to fully fund that program out of the O&M budget, you've got to take other things out of O&M, such as training and exercises, the kinds of things that reflect on what our strategy overseas is about, and that's where you see the connection. If we're not training, if we're not exercising, if we're not deploying, then the bad guys of the world, who really don't care about our budgetary problems except to hope they continue, will draw the wrong conclusions as far as we're concerned. And finally, the outlook for a solution to sequesters is pretty bleak. People are sort of beginning to take the sequester for granted. Secretary Hagel announced today that furloughs will be 11 days for Defense Department personnel, which is essentially less than one a week for the next 4.5 months, and that there will be exemptions so that if you can manage particularly your O&M budgets, you can exempt people like, say, shipyard workers from furloughs entirely. Well, that just reinforces the sense of complacency about what the sequester is really about. And so I understand Mr. Kendall was talking about sort of raindrops accumulating. Well, this is kind of like the first day of Noah's 40-day flood. You know, when it started out, the ark wasn't resting on anything but land. But then you know what happened. And this is exactly the situation we have today. And then when you factor in the reality that defense is essentially collateral damage to a major campaign between those who want to raise taxes and those who want to cut entitlements. That's where the elephants are really fighting. And defense is a sideshow. And people may have believed that defense could make the difference, but clearly it has not, and there's no indication that it will. People say, okay, next year, if we have this again, we'll have a continuing resolution again. The fact that that will totally distort program planning even more doesn't seem to bother people. And on that happy note, I will turn to Admiral Burke.
Thanks, Dov. Just one thing before I start about what the N9 is. In the Navy, we've done something here in the last year where we take the people, the training, the readiness, the maintenance, the platforms, and the ordnance associated with ships, submarines, amphibs, carriers, and most of the air wing, and put it all in one place, and that's the N9. That allows us to better address wholeness or avoiding hollowness in the force. Secretary Kendall did speak about lots of cuts, and let me just talk about a couple of them from a Navy perspective. We deferred 8 surface ship availabilities and reduced the scope of another 1 or 2. We certainly hope to buy those back, but it's hard to see how we would buy them back if the sequester continues. We're also reducing several maintenance activities at the intermediate level, so the next level down from the depot. Dov mentioned furloughs. If we were to furlough in the shipyard, the impact would go something like this. You'd miss out on maybe a day a week, or in this case, maybe less than a day a week, but there would be no overtime. There would be no increase in hiring that we've been trying to do. And so you might see as much as a 40% decline in what the workforce actually does. So we're really concerned about the potential impact of furloughs on our shipyards and depots. But a big impact is on the deployment readiness of our forces. We will continue to maintain 2.0 carrier and 2.0 carrier strike group and 2.0 ARG amphibious ready group presence. But those forces that are back here in the U.S. getting ready to go are the ones that take the hit. Typically, we have about 50% of our force ready to go. Today, we have about a third of our force ready to go. And as we stop flying or operating and dig ourselves into a bathtub, I guess that's sort of a mixed metaphor there, but get ourselves into a bathtub, the ability to climb out of that bathtub still exists. But it costs more to climb out of it than it would have if we'd have kept flying and operating at the same level we had been. Now, one of the reasons that the impact has not been felt in a great way at this point is that there are unobligated funds out there that people can go after in the near term. So in doing that, you're robbing from the future to pay for today. And we have done some of that, and that'll probably continue. The opportunity is there because when you think about procurement, you buy over 5 years of a ship, you're paying for 10% of that ship in year 1, maybe 20% in year 2, 40% in year 3. So as you get into successive years of sequestration, that cascading effect will show itself. There's just a couple other things here that, one, Admiral Daly and I used to talk about this all the time, but we have a backlog in surface ship maintenance. So we have about $2 billion in surface ship maintenance that exists that we need to get after, because if we don't do that maintenance, we will find ourselves retiring those ships early. And there's no cheaper way to get a ship than to keep it in service through doing the appropriate maintenance. It's much cheaper than buying a new one. And we need to keep those that we have, maintain them, modernize them, and that's a bargain compared to buying new. Additionally, the Navy is heavily reliant on supplemental funding, what's called overseas contingency operations funding. We have about $3 billion that ought to be in our baseline budget that's in this so-called OCO funding. If when that OCO or supplemental funding dries up, we will need to figure out how to put that money back into our base budget. If we don't, we risk further reductions in ship service life. And then I will also say on the shore side, we have taken shortcuts in our shore maintenance over the last several years, and 13 is no different. We'll take more shortcuts there because we want to do the best we can for our operating forces. But at some point, if your bases don't support your operating and training, you're hurting yourself more than if you had taken care of those and maybe reduced operations a little bit. And then finally, I'd say that one of the reasons we offered up 2 LSDs and 7 cruisers in last year's budget, or in the 13 budget, was because we felt like we needed to reduce our structure a little bit, a terribly difficult decision, but in order to use that money, harvest that money that would have gone to those platforms to keep the others operating longer. So it was truly a business decision. We had more structure than we could afford, and rather than continue to operate at a reduced maintenance level on most of it, we decided to turn those in and harvest that money. Now, we've gotten some pushback from Congress in that they've funded some of those operations for a couple years, and we're working on how to address that now. With that, I'll look forward to your questions.
Thanks very much. One thing to bear in mind, that because there is so much that's been exempted in terms of MILPERS and parts of O&M, the bulk of the sequester cuts fall on acquisition, procurement, R&D, the kinds of things Admiral Burke is talking about. But General Dyson's got a somewhat different problem, because in fiscal 13, OCO was not exempted. And so it too had to pay into the sequester. But in reality, you've got to fund operations overseas, sequester or no sequester, which means you're taking money out of your operations at home. That doesn't make life easy. For fiscal 14, we don't even have an OCO number yet, and we don't know whether OCO will be exempted or not, because that's up to the White House. So maybe, General Dyson, you'll tell us a bit more.
Thank you, Dr. Zackheim. Good afternoon, everyone. Dr. Zackheim is exactly right in that each of the services faces a different problem in FY13. When we look at how we landed, the title of our panel is "How Did We Land and What Does It Mean?" I want to tell you about how the Army landed and what the Army's problem is, which is very different from the Navy's problem and very different from the Air Force's problem. When we received our appropriation at the end of March, I think the first thing it's important to recognize is that we were already 6 months into the fiscal year. So each of the services, Army included, had a very difficult challenge with executing under suppressed funding that the continuing resolution brought for 6 months. So when we received our appropriation, we were able to sort of get healthy, if you will, by about $6 billion from the roughly $18 billion that we were down from our requested level in FY13. When we first started talking about the challenges to the Army, we used something that would be very easy to remember and to categorize our numbers. We said that we had a problem that could be characterized by 6, 6, and 6. In 3 different categories, we were down by $6 billion roughly in each category. So the appropriation got us healthy and got us off of the continuing resolution. We received authorities to be able to start spending procurement dollars and get ourselves on solid footing for the rest of the year. But then we had to lay in the sequestration. The sequestration for the Army was about $7.6 billion in total. About 4.6 of that was in our Operation and Maintenance Army, our active OMA account. And that is the account that funds training and builds readiness for the Army. So the Army embarked on a prioritization drill to be able to decide where we would put the appropriated dollars and therefore also identify where we would take sequestration. The sequestration cuts were largely taken in reset and depot maintenance, in facilities, sustainment and restoration and modernization, and some of it in op-tempo. So some of the actions that we've taken is we have deliberately deferred maintenance on some equipment, some of it coming out of the theater that we can identify that doesn't need to go back in, and we've deferred a lot of maintenance on our facilities. In the area of op-tempo, we have canceled some combat training center exercises and some command and staff training exercises, which is the culminating event, live fire exercises that culminate our brigade combat teams training and validation of readiness. And as has been stated here, the impacts are not immediate for the nation and not immediate for the Army. But what happens is over time, when these units who could not go and train continue to evolve into FY14, their readiness posture is eroding. And so if we need them, if they need to be called upon, it will take us longer to be able to train them, and it will require more resources to get them back to where they were before we found ourselves in this situation. But the biggest problem, these were all challenges for the Army, but the biggest problem that the Army has is in the account that Admiral Burke talked about, the Overseas Contingency Operations account. But our problem is a problem of here and now. Our problem is that the Army is the executive agent for funding the warfight. And the budget that we have for FY13 is short by about $8 billion. And so we are having to see if we can realign funds within the Department of Defense, and we're working on that, to solve as much of the problem as we can. What we estimate is that we will only be able to solve about $5 billion of that problem. That will leave us with $3 billion of a bill that supports the warfight, which of course is our top priority, as it is the nation's top priority. And so as we look out to the future, just the near-term future, with no ability to realign funds after we've achieved the maximum amount that's allowable by law, the only place we can go is into our operation and maintenance accounts, which will further degrade readiness of our units. That's our biggest challenge that we see today. As we look at FY14, we are beginning to adapt our strategy to the defense strategy, but everything that we look to do to adapt ourselves to the defense strategy will be impacted by the challenges that we have in FY13. And as Admiral Burke said, while we have absorbed sequestration in 13, we are really wrestling with this problem of OCO and supporting the warfight. But if we go into FY14 in the same posture where we are under continuing resolution, where we are under an automatic sequestration that's not tied to strategy, then we will have further degradation to readiness to our Army units. And with that, I look forward to your questions, and I will pass on to my colleague.
Thank you. Eric Labs, you've been watching this for many years. Obviously, we'd like to hear your diagnosis of the problem and perhaps also thoughts out of CBO in terms of how to deal with it.
Thank you very much, Dr. Zackheim. I first need to start off with a disclaimer that the views I express here are my own and not those of the Congressional Budget Office and certainly not of the U.S. Congress. Dov, I'm not sure I'm going to be able to answer the questions you want, but I'll start with some thoughts here. The first set of thoughts I'm going to offer you are sort of on the issue of the Budget Control Act of 2011. Admiral Burke and General Dyson can speak far more eloquently than I can about the operational impacts of the process that's going on in fiscal year 2013. But I would like to sort of make one observation about the Control Act and I think there was a missed opportunity here by the Department of Defense when on August 3rd, 2011, and the Budget Control Act was passed. The Department of Defense made a decision not to sort of plan to the BCA upper caps initially and then the lower caps especially, even though that was going to be the law as it was currently written at that time. I mean, if the process of sequestration, I mean, remember, sequestration is a process by which if you do not comply with the lower caps in the BCA, then sequestration is going to mindlessly take all that money from you proportionally across all of your accounts. If you don't like sequestration, one of the ways you can avoid it is plan and budget to and appropriate to the BCA lower caps, lower levels. And when the administration didn't, or not the administration, but the department didn't sort of present a plan to sort of show what the impact of that might be, I think in some ways they missed an opportunity to show the country, show the Hill, show the administration what was going to be the impact of the Budget Control Act on the Department of Defense over an extended period of time, over a 10-year horizon. So we're kind of living in this world now where, with the subject of sequestration, everyone says that they hate it, everyone wants to change it. Very few people are actually doing anything about it, and the department has budgeted and planned to the BCA upper caps, not the lower caps that are going to be enforced by sequestration. So to use the title of this, the subtitle of this particular panel, what does it all mean? Well, from my perspective, what it all means is it's budget pain pretty much as far as the eye can see. We're certainly going to face a lot of budget pain over the next 10 years, no matter how you look at it. Even if there is an agreement to sort of undo the Budget Control Act lower caps, if the upper caps are still left in place, sort of basically the administration's plan under the current FIDIP is very closely aligned, not perfectly, but closely aligned with the BCA higher caps. CBO's analysis shows that the department is still going to be about $300 billion short over a 10-year period in their plans and programs based on historical cost growth, what normally sort of gets appropriated, or laws and benefits that are passed for the Department of Defense. So we still think there's a shortfall there. If you are stuck at those BCA lower caps, then you've got a budget pain that even on the administration's perspective, a 10-year window is going to be $500 billion short. As you all know, CBO's estimate would put it at more like $800 billion short over a 10-year period. So then it comes to, what are the alternatives to do about it? And I'm talking about sort of longer term, 10-year type of alternatives. And you really are confronted with sort of two choices and combinations thereof, which is, you reduce operations and you reduce maintenance and you reduce funding and that sort of things. Essentially, you hollow out the force, or you reduce force structure, and you can do some sort of combination of both. And both of those mechanisms to sort of achieve those goals are worth discussion. Hollowing out the force is not necessarily an absolutely unalloyed bad thing. One of the advantages of hollowing out the force is that if your preference is to leave force again from a hollow force a lot quicker than you can buy new. I'm not advocating that. I'm just sort of pointing out that if we are stuck with these BCA lower caps for a long period of time, those are the kinds of debates that the country ought to have as to sort of what do they want to do with the Department of Defense and what they want the Department of Defense to be doing and how they want to carry out, how do they want to provide the department with what it's going to need to carry out the missions that the country wants it to do. No matter how you look at it, though, I do think in the end there is force structure. A colleague of mine at CBO, David Arthur, wrote a report that looked at sort of different alternatives as how you can comply with the BCA lower caps. And he's got 4 different alternatives in there, but all of them in the end, even when you take more money from operations or less money from operations are going to result in a smaller force structure. His options ended up the result being that where you cut anywhere from 14 to 18 brigade combat teams, 28 to 58 ships, and anywhere from 200 to sort of 500 Air Force aircraft. When you're talking about cuts of an average of either 11 to 16%, depending on whether you believe the FIDIP extension number or the CBO estimate, you're talking about 11 to 16% of DoD's funding over a 10-year period. That inevitably will lead to cuts in force structure in the absence of any relief. So on that happy note, I will turn it over to the private sector.
Thanks very much. There is another alternative or package of alternatives that was released in a report yesterday by the Stimson Center that drew upon work from the Defense Business Board and others that talks about efficiencies. Trouble is that requires, in most cases, congressional activity, which brings you back to the point that Eric made about congressional inactivity. Jim McAleese, you're one of the shrewdest outside observers of defense budgets, and you also have a very keen insight into how defense industry is responding. So over to you.
Great. Good morning. Can you guys hear me? I see one or two people in the back that are still awake. All right. I'll take care of that, sir, very quickly. May I ask a quick question, Dove, with your permission? Kind of to tailor my comments today to what you guys want to hear as opposed to what I want to talk about. Can you kind of give me a quick show of hands? Army guys interested? Army programs? Okay, a few in the back, right-hand side. Okay. Let me ask the stupid question. Navy? Okay. Navy ships? Navy aircraft? Okay, good combination. How about Air Force? Okay, over there, a little over there. Okay, no Marines? The sleepers. All right, let me give you that'll help tailor my comments. And I'm kind of just think about this as kind of some McAleese truisms. The first thing I would probably start with is no matter what we're going to see out of this, the skimmer activities, no matter what we're going to see out of the 2013 sequester, and no matter what we've seen so far out of the 2014 budget request, right, I think one of the enduring platforms in terms of the mission that we are going to see is going to be a continued rebalance to the Pacific. Okay, that's got to be number one. Don't let General Dyson hear that I said this. That obviously favors obviously the Navy and the Air Force, number one. But I think it's going to be a reality, and I think we've already turned that corner for what it's worth. Number two, I would have told you, I probably would have bet my car that within about 2 to 4 weeks after sequester, that when it hit on March 2nd, that we would have had a congressional solution and that it would have been retroactive. I had to walk down here today. I'm now carless. But the reality that I'm trying to get across is, hey, 2013 sequester, it's a done deal now. Okay? And now what we're fundamentally fighting over is whether or not there's going to be a 2014 sequester. Does anyone disagree with me on that? Is anyone still waiting for a silver bullet? Okay, so we know where we stand. You guys are very familiar with the skimmer, correct? So Secretary Hagel, Dr. Carter's Strategic Choices Management Review. I would generally tend to, I think Dove had mentioned earlier, we would expect that in about maybe June. I don't know what skimmer is going to bring us, but I think it's going to bring us one of three outcomes, right? It's either going to bring us approximately a $150 billion cut, right, over a 10-year period, which would be approximately $15 billion per year, which would be about a 3% cut out of the base budget. And I think that would be the best case analysis we could hope for in terms of skimmer going forward to 2015. Number two, the worst case analysis we could expect from skimmer would be something short of about $500 billion, right? That would put us at about $50 billion a year, which is about 10%. And my instincts tell me that the department's going to be very reluctant to go there. My instincts tell me we're probably going to be somewhere in the middle. We know the president has already proposed $150 billion worth of cuts to the department over a 10-year period, most of those being backloaded into 2018 and beyond. So even though I'm not consulted by the department on skimmer, I got to believe that the starting point is going to be about $150 billion plus. And my instincts tell me we're probably going to end up somewhere in the ballpark of about $250 billion. So as I look forward into the future, in addition to the previous Budget Control Act cuts, I look at it and say, hey, what are the critical missions? How do we do more with less? And fundamentally, what would the situation look like if we had about $25 billion less per year, which is about a 5% reduction, okay? One thing I will definitely tell you as I go through the 2014 budget request, and this is part of why I believe that we've already turned the corner to the rebalance to the Pacific. I can clearly see that the Air Force classified programs in terms of RDT&E and procurement, and General Miller, yes, I see you in the front row, remained quite healthy and quite robust. I can also tell you that I see C&O Greener investing very significantly in AAAD. You see it in programs such as Next Generation Jammer. You see it in AMDR, right? You see it in UClass. You see it in BAMS, right? You can clearly see the Navy is standing behind the AAAD, and they're shifting there now. One thing I would caution you, how many of you guys are industry? Okay. Civilians? Okay, you guys are supposed to be furloughed. You're not supposed to be here today? All right. Sir, they didn't laugh at that joke. Uh-oh. It's a serious crowd. With respect to industry, one thing I would caution you, is we know that Secretary Hagel and Dr. Carter have been strong proponents of the industrial base. I would generally tend to caution you that as the more aggressive the skimmer becomes, the longer the 2013 sequester cuts go on, the bigger cuts to the 2014 budget request we see, the department is going to be less and less able to protect the defense industrial base as we've known it historically. Okay? So what I'm really trying to tell you is the help from the building at that point in time is going to be few and far between, and there's going to be a significant number of market forces and a significant number of bet the company time competitions that are ultimately going to determine winners and losers. I wanted to give you guys a little bit of kind of thoughts on Army winners, Navy winners, Air Force winners. As you know, we've had our 2014 budget request out since April 10th, but it wasn't until last Thursday night that we finally got our hands on the reclusive book that General Dyson and Admiral Burke would refer to as the 2014 DoD Green Book. So for the first time, this is going to show me where the CNO plans to take and put his resources all the way out in 15, 16, 17, 18, or the same thing with General Odierno, right? Or the same thing with General Welsh. A couple of things to keep in mind regardless of sequester. When you think about Army, and I defer to General Dyson on this, in terms of the new FIDEP that we've just seen as of Thursday night, start thinking about Abrams and Bradley difficult situations now. That's funded out of the WNTC, the track combat vehicles. But think about very significant uptick in approximately 2017 and 2018 as General Dyson resources the Armored Multi-Purpose Vehicle and also the Ground Combat Vehicle number 1. Number 2, think positive winners in terms of network. For those of you guys who do Army network, think this is Warfighter Information Network Tactical, or WIN-T, right? And this is also going to be the JTRS, the Joint Tactical Radio System, handheld small man-pack, okay? Trucks are taking a heck of a beating right now in 2013, 2014 budget. We all know this. I was really pleased to see the Army stand behind production 2015, 2016, 17, 18 of the Joint Light Tactical Vehicle. I was holding my breath on that right up to the last second. Losers, think Army helicopters, right? We've seen the LUH, light utility helicopter, being canceled this year. AH-64 new build. Not to worry, they're going to remanufacture instead. It'll be cheaper. But basically, by the end of 2018, the majority of the portfolio of Army aircraft that General Dyson is resourcing is really going to come to an end. Okay? Navy. This is 80% of the crowd. 2013, 2014, big, and Doug cut me off if I overstep my time. Admiral Burke would be the first one to tell you that 2013 was a huge year for Navy shipbuilding. There was a $2 billion plus up, right? That picked up NSSN advanced procurement, right? That picked up an extra DDG-51 that paid for a little bit of $263 million, if I recall, in LPD-17 advanced procurement as well. That same pattern of shipbuilding being a significant winner re-emerged in the 2014 budget request. And so when you heard Admiral Burke talk about the ship operations O&M account, right? Remember, separate from procurement, right? The more of those ships that he's buying, the bigger the ship operations account that he's going to have to use to resource that. Think also ship depot O&M accounts. Those are the two big winners that are very, very visible to me. Aircraft procurement did well this year at about $18 billion. But I will tell you, Growlers did well, F-35 CV Stovall did well, but I'm noticing a pattern of shifting of money from the aircraft procurement, particularly programs that are new in development, BAMs, right? E-2D Hawkeye should have ramped up more aggressively, even the P-8 program, okay? So I believe that we're seeing a shift from the historic APN account into the SC account number one. I think it's a very important shift. I think it's consistent. I defer to Admiral Burke. I think that's very consistent with Admiral Greener's vision. Last thoughts on Air Force winners and losers. Think aircraft. For the first year, we finally got, General Welsh has finally got a FIDEP that shows some very aggressive growth in 2015. The curve spikes by about $2 billion. The programs that you need to watch of his are going to be two big boys. It's going to be KC-46 tanker, and it's going to be F-35 CTOL. Those two programs go into heavy production starting in 2015. Last but not least, think other procurement, Air Force. This is where the Air Force, like General Miller, resources, historically, that's all the classified programs. And I eventually expect the LRSB will eventually materialize sometime there. And think also the Air Force has about another $12 billion of classified RDT&E. So the Air Force did well this year, not quite as well as the Navy did, but they did get about an extra $4 billion of upside. And that's just some candid thoughts. I'm sorry I overran. I'm getting the hook. Let me shut up.
Well, thanks very much. You overran, but at least for once it was a worthwhile overrun, not like some of the others that we deal with in the budget. So I'm not too upset about it at all. Throw it open to you all for questions. Those of you who are upset that we spoke a little longer than we should have, too bad. Questions, please. And just say who you are, first of all. That would be helpful, and whom you're addressing in your question.
Good afternoon. Travis Dollister with the Defense Threat Reduction Agency. The question is for anyone on the panel. In the future, as we climb out of this bathtub, what is more concerning to you? The overextension of the budget after the sequester is lifted, or possible congressional and public acceptance of a sequester-oriented budgetary status quo?
Well, I'll give you my quick answer. It's the latter. I believe that public acceptance of the sequester status quo is actually growing, not diminishing. And when you listen to the various presentations, particularly Jim's about out years, the sequester is also in the out years, and what does that do to all our plans? So I'm pretty pessimistic, I'm afraid. Lady, gentlemen, anybody?
Yeah. There we go. One thing I wanted to add to that, you were asking about the pain that's associated with sequester. How many of you guys own defense stocks? I see one, I see a couple in the back. Have you guys noticed that the value of your portfolio is about, your defense stock portfolio is up about 5% above the S&P 500? One of the things that I'm seeing that's unique that we haven't seen before is I think when Dove talked about the concern of, we were very concerned about sequester and oh my God, the danger really didn't come. You're actually seeing that priced into the defense contractors as we speak. Whether you talk Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, Northrop Grumman, they're all priced at 52-week highs, right? They're trading at about a 5% premium over the S&P 500 as we speak. As you know, all the defense companies just finished their first quarter results over the last 2 weeks, right? And the things that I look at, as Dove looks at it, and as Eric and General Dyson and Admiral Burke look at it, they're watching the resourcing going into the contractors, and I'm trying to look at also the resourcing in terms of the financial results that come out of the contractors. And what I saw was very interesting. If you look at the impact to our industrial base so far, particularly the larger contractors, Lockheed, Boeing, secondarily Northrop, Raytheon, GD, L3, those are really your big six. And what I saw is I saw a pattern in their first quarter results of 2013. Remember, we're 2 months into, I guess, one and a half months into sequester. And quite literally, none of their sales had fallen at all. Number two, almost all the contractors gave a worst-case projection of only a 2% reduction in terms of their 2013 sales, which means those contractors are going to have a particularly significant ability to withstand sequester at least until probably 2014. So the DoD customer is going to pay the bill first. The contractors aren't going to feel the pain probably until about next year. Number three, as a general rule of thumb, the contractors showed earnings, operating margins of approximately 12 to 13%, which is fair, right? But very significant. And then the last thing that you should watch in terms of the contractors going forward, you want to start watching their book to bill. In other words, as a DoD customer, are they clawing back the money? They're just not able to put that money under contract with General Dyson in terms of what she's got in terms of the fight. So therefore, the orders don't show up in terms of GD or so on and so forth. What we did find in the first quarter was basically that the book to bill was in line with the historic patterns. So as a practical matter, what I'm really telling you is that the contractors, their performance is actually defying sequester.
To go side to side, please.
Thank you. Terry Casto, retired defense contractor and concerned taxpayer, so conflicted somewhat in this environment. Sir, Dr. Zackheim, you introduced the Stimson report, but I didn't really hear it factored into your comments. So for the panel at large and Mr. McAleese in particular, the Stimson report outlines a plan for $1 trillion over 10 years with no impact to force readiness or force capability. Is that pie in the sky? Are there real solutions there?
Well, I think, as I did indicate, so much of it depends on the Congress, and it's not clear. I mean, the Stimson report, like so many others, talks about reforms to defense health, for instance. We've been trying that for a very long time. It talks about acquisition reform. We've passed several acquisition reform acts, and currently the Defense Department is dealing with acquisition reform. It talks about how we allocate resources to defense civilians and defense contractors. Some of that DoD can do by itself. Civilians is a problem in any event because OPM controls civilians, not DoD. I think where there will be some hit will be certain kinds of contractors, particularly those who deal with staff augmentation. There are some creative ways to deal with military retirement, but there's a commission that's been put together just to deal with that. And just to give you an indicator of how hard all of this is, there was an attempt to have that commission essentially, that is to say the compensation commission, which is more than retirement, it has to do with pay and everything else. There was an attempt to treat it the way they treat BRAC commissions, which is BRAC exercises, which is essentially to tell Congress vote it up or down, no amendments. That was voted down, which means there will be amendments to whatever legislation is put together coming out of the BRAC commission, which means in turn that the whole thing could get watered down big time. So yes, in an abstract sense, you could probably find the kinds of economies that would really mitigate the sequester. But in reality, you're going to have to fight for every single dollar of those economies and hope for the best.
I would just add that if you expect that sort of those ideas to pan out, they're not going to pan out in the next couple years. It'll take some time before they could potentially be implemented. During that time, you still have a big bill, and so that probably means force structure. And in the Navy, force structure is ships and planes. I think in the Army, it's probably more people, but as a capital-intensive service, it means taking out force structure in the near term.
Yeah, please.
Good afternoon. My name is Bob Fortin. I'm with Juniper Networks. In the last 10 years, we've seen incidents of state-sponsored terrorism, intrusions into our DoD systems, banking systems, et cetera, and investments in IT systems have achieved the same level of priority as weapons systems. And I'm wondering, going forward, where do you see the priority and the importance of IT investments in the whole budget landscape when you're making decisions of what to invest in and what to cut? Where does IT end up? Thank you.
Well, I would like to answer that for the Army. For the Army, the network is the Army's #1 procurement priority. And, you know, we feel it's very, very important that we are focusing on the soldier and on the squad, small unit levels, as we adapt our mission support to the Pacific. This gives me an opportunity to address Mr. McAleese's kind of sidebar, comment about the Asia shift being really focused on the Navy and the Air Force. But that doesn't mean that there's not a role for the Army, and there's a very important role for the Army in the Pacific. And a lot of that has to do with our people-to-people contact, with our ability to conduct the small partnership exercises and build relationships throughout many of the countries that comprise the Pacific. And what's very important in all of that is when we do that with small groups, tailored packages. And those tailored packages have to be armed and equipped with the best intel, with the best communications capabilities that we can give them. So that's our #1 priority, and I would hope that you would see that as we move ahead, as we try to work within our budget limitations to bring the programs that we need to fruition.
I would just add that we have generally in DoD writ large, we have placed a high premium on IT, electronic warfare, cyber forces, and so you can see that in the budget. And certainly, when Admiral Ruff had established the N2, N6 combination of 3 or 4 years ago in the Navy, that is heavily focused on that electronic piece of the action.
I would just add, since the Air Force isn't represented here, if you look at the major shift to UAVs, that's not possible without a huge investment in IT. Sir.
Mark Furtick with Ace Tech Partners. In the follow-on to the IT question, there's been a tremendous uptick in protest activity on all procurements, certainly compared to the 10 or 12 or 15 years that I've been in the space. I wonder how that affects your ability to plan when programs that used to get fielded in 6 to 18 months are now taking 36 to 60 months or longer.
I'll take it. I don't know how to really comment on this other than the obvious. It's painful when there are protests and it drags things out. It causes us to not have systems when we expected to have them, and then systems that are associated with those or procurements that are associated with those are potentially put in trouble. And in a time of when you're short on budget, people are looking to take that money, and so it creates a heck of a lot of churn, both in the service as well as in OSD, and much of the churn happens not just in the programming, but in execution as well. And so it's a real mess when that sort of thing happens.
And I can just follow on from the budget execution perspective. What Admiral Burke just said is one of our biggest concerns, is the programs then become inexecutable within the time frame that the money was appropriated for that program. And then we stand to lose the funding for that program. And then that starts the slippery slope of being able to keep that program going.
Let me just add one more thing here. And this is a sort of collateral effect, but it's had a major impact. Because of all these protests, contracting officers have become very, very uneasy about doing anything other than going with lowest cost. They basically, some have told me they've been advised by the lawyers to do that. Well, of course, if you go with lowest cost, you're not necessarily getting best quality. And in an environment where you already have major budget constraints anyway, defaulting to lowest cost seems the easiest way to go. And as we sometimes see, when you do that, you are not putting the best equipment into the hands of our young people who are risking their lives for us. Please go ahead.
Bob Hinger with Booz Allen Hamilton. You used to be a programmer in the Air Force, so all the pain you folks are discussing reminds me of when we would yell and scream at the DOD comptroller with it. The same type of guidance came down, whether it was salami slice, peanut butter spread, or trying to fix broken glass during budget execution. And one of the things, I grew up in the DBOF, Defense Business Operating Fund arena when that came about, and now it's the working capital funds. So the question is more towards that. Is there any fertile ground with that now coming out of funding the war coming to an end? I know we can't do that during wartime because that doesn't make sense. So are there more efficiencies out there in an operating fund, and or can that be expanded throughout the federal government and not just reside inside a DOD, especially when we have mission creep where the department is helping out in Homeland Security and financial areas that isn't our main mission area?
So in the Army, our working capital fund business has really, I think, increased over the years of the war because our depots and are working inside of the working capital fund. And we have implemented a lot of efficiencies, Lean Six Sigma programs over the years to bring efficiencies to bear, and are very proud of the work that's been done there. So and many of our depots have won awards for these and have become a model for industry and others that, for ideas that they can implement. The thing we worry about, though, today, as we come out of war and as we, are facing these budget shortfalls and we take risk, i.e. we take reductions in depot maintenance and in reset, and we decrease the amount of work going through the depots, the concern we have is that now we will start to go the other way. Our prices will have to start to increase, and we're also concerned about the impact on our people because if our workload is drawing down, then we have to release some of our temp and term employees inside the depots. So, the working capital fund, the pendulum swings back and forth. Well, I'm concerned now that we're swinging in a direction where our prices will start to go up, and we face a different kind of challenge than the implementation of the efficiencies that the Army really has achieved over the last several years.
Eric?
I don't know that I have a whole lot to add to what General Dyson said, but Dove's point at the beginning that I've sort of been doing this job for a long time. I'm sort of 15, 18 years at CBO now, and the discussion of sort of getting efficiencies out of the Department of Defense is something that comes up with a regular basis, and we talk about it all the time, and sometimes we implement some things. We do occasionally have gotten a BRAC round or two in the past, but the idea that we're going to sort of, and I'm thinking more broadly here than your specific question, the idea that we're going to solve our budgetary problem with efficiencies when CBO estimates that budgetary problem to be in the sort of $800 billion range over a 10-year period, I think is just not realistic. And as Admiral Burke already pointed out, even if we could somehow gather those efficiencies together in a package, it is not something that can occur overnight. And even if it were voted on overnight, it couldn't be implemented overnight. So the one thing about going back to a previous question about the Stimson report, I haven't read it, so I don't know everything that's included in that. But one of the things it does at least help illustrate is that, okay, if you start going after some of these other things in the department, whether it's BRAC, whether it's overly ambitious pay and benefits and things like that, all those types of things that are eating away at the acquisition accounts in the department, it does sort of help you give a number to do that and sort of how much money that you might be able to gain back from it. But I don't think it's realistic to think that acquisition reform, efficiencies, doing things better, faster, cheaper is going to yield a whole lot of money to be able to put towards force structure.
I would just throw out on the working capital fund, we see tremendous value in it, but one of the concerns I have about working capital funds is that they're out looking for business. And on one hand, that's a good thing, but I have a tough time figuring out why they're doing some business that has nothing to do with the Navy. And granted, it's reducing their overhead, but in some cases, these organizations are growing, and they still rely on support from a base or support in other ways that is not captured in the working capital. So it's not as clean as we'd like it to be, but there are certainly positives in the working capital fund.
Any other questions out there? Have we silenced you all? Well, let me then turn to each of our panelists, because I do have a couple of minutes left for us. And why don't you give us your final thoughts, and I'll start at the other end of the table. What thoughts would you leave us with?
Can you guys hear me? First of all, I apologize, General Dyson. That was not... I didn't mean to slam General O'Dearn. I didn't mean to slam the Army. It is a joint fight, number one, and I personally apologize for overstepping. I did get a little carried over exuberant there. To respond to that one question on the gentleman with the IT, okay, the number you're looking for is about $4.7 billion in the 2014 budget for cyber, and the other number you're looking for is about $40 billion per year in terms of the total 2014 DoD budget request. That's the IT piece, okay? Just thoughts. I'm hoping. I mean, the reality is, when the Budget Control Act in reality was the equivalent of a pink duck-billed platypus. It was an artificial construct. It's an animal that doesn't exist in the wild. You know, one of the things we do is we do have to mirror what the American people decide in terms of the resourcing for national security. We know we have a sine wave. That sine curve is usually between constant year dollars, and Admiral Burke and Eric and Dyson could talk about this till I'm blue in the face. They know more than I know about this. But the sine curve is usually about $400 billion, right, in terms of the trough after drawdowns, Korea, Vietnam, so on and so forth. And usually the peak is about $550 billion. So, I mean, one of the things you got to be careful of with the Budget Control Act is that it effectively was the forfeiture of the department's future planned growth, right? There are some cuts in it, no doubt about it. 2013 was worse than 2012 in terms of the actual downside, in terms of like Air Force top line going down. But the reality is the Budget Control Act basically froze the department in perpetuity at about a $550 billion base budget going forward. I am extremely hopeful. I was wrong about 2013 sequester. I thought it was going to be resolved. I'm sadly mistaken. I got to think that we're probably going to see in the fall, after the congressional recess, is when I would start looking for cooler heads to prevail. The House is going to do its mark about a week and a half from now, as you all know. They're going to mark to a much higher budget. The Senate will mark to a much different budget, and that'll set up kind of the authorization issues going forward. So I would mark your calendars for probably about maybe September. I think Dove is very concerned about the CR. I think he's right. I don't think people generally understand the damage we do to the Army when we trap them under a CR. Okay? But I'm hopeful that probably by about October, November, December is when we should see some sort of a compromise. And my instincts tell me to warn you that it's going to be more than, that it's going to be more than 150K, 150 billion over 10 years. I don't think it's going to be the 500 billion over 10 years. I think we're going to end somewhere in the middle, in the ballpark of about a 200 billion-ish to about a 250 billion-ish reduction over a 10-year period of time, which equates to about a 5 to 6% reduction over time.
Thank you. Eric?
I don't have necessarily a whole lot to say in final thoughts. A couple points. I just actually want to make one slight correction to what Mr. McAleese had said, that the DoD share of the National Defense limitation in the Budget Control Act is actually less than $550 billion. It's $550 billion per year. It's actually closer to about $500 billion a year. In constant 2013 dollars, you actually never hit $500 billion for the DoD share, because the rest of the category of national defense is being used to sort of fund some other categories like nuclear activities in the Department of Energy. I'm not quite as sanguine as you are about some sort of compromise coming out in September. I think it's more than likely we will head into fiscal year 2014 under sequestration. And I'm not certain I will say for how long through fiscal year 2014, but it wouldn't surprise me if it lasts the entire year again. I think ultimately, until the department actually sort of shows what its plans look like under the BCA lower caps, and what, over a 10-year period, what that truly means in concrete terms, I'm not sure what the impetus for compromise is. I mean, both the House and the Senate have passed budget resolutions that allocate defense spending not too far from each other. So some people sort of look at those defense spending lines and say, oh, well, it can't be that too hard to compromise. The problem with that is that those two resolutions, the House and the Senate, the total budget resolutions are very far apart from each other in lots of other ways. How they get to those numbers, whether it's by increasing taxes on the Senate side and cutting and absolutely no increase in taxes on the House side, is going to make, I think, the process of political compromise to undo the lower caps that are enshrined in the Budget Control Act is going to be, I think, a very, very difficult thing to achieve.
General Dyson.
Thank you. Well, I'm very troubled to hear my colleagues here perspective that we may be entering FY14 in a continuing resolution and under sequestration. But unfortunately, I don't disagree with it. It does seem to be the direction that we're heading. And that is hugely problematic for each of the services that comprises the Department of Defense. I think, one of the things that I would ask you to take away from here is that, we have all recognized that sequestration is here. It's a done deal. Somebody said it's a done deal in 13, and now the debate is about 14, and really, in some sense, it's really about the total long term. So we all have to have a long-term perspective. The strategic review that's being done by the Department of Defense today is hugely important to all of us. Because we really need a strategic change in order to achieve the levels of reductions that are being talked about and that are being demanded in the sequestration. And at the end of the day, when we look at how those changes will be made, we all have to remember that when we go to the warfight, it takes each one of the services working together to be successful in the joint theater. And so that national perspective is very important as we take that long-term perspective to look at how the reductions will be made. And I think that's what's being wrestled with right now inside of the skimmer at the Department of Defense. And so I'm hopeful that we'll see some results that come out of that will give us some direction that we can start to make some strategic decisions off of. Thank you.
There are essentially 5 main accounts. One is the people account, one is the shore account, one is the R&D account, one is procurement, and one is readiness and maintenance. The people account, you have to pay the people if you have them. We are about to, probably by the end of this year, we'll be over executing on people. So we'll be spending more money than we need to be. The R&D accounts, you heard Secretary talk earlier about how that's taken a hit and he'd like to get it back up. The shore accounts in the Navy have been underfunded for a number of years and continue to take a hit. So that means it's hard to go to those accounts and take more money out. So that means you're at procurement or readiness and maintenance. And, if you buy more of one, you get less of the other. And we're already short in the maintenance accounts because we're reliant on OCO. And, that's another big chunk of money that's going to dry up probably over the course of the fit-up. And it's not $100 billion a year, but it's it's in the 80 to 90 billion dollar a year range. So when that goes away, that's going to be a pretty significant hit for the services. Secondly, I'd like to say I'm of the view that we'll be in a continuing resolution come October 1st, and it'll be interesting to see what we do there, because do we follow the law of the land? Do we, in our spending, I should say, we'll certainly follow the law of the land at some point, but do we spend like we have it? Or like we're going to get it? Do we spend conservatively? We didn't spend conservatively this last time around because there was an expectation of a deal. Will we be that naive again? I don't know. And then finally, I just close with saying we will be far better off if we get to resolution on this rather than this annual churn. I mean, we are wasting so much precious time in dealing with this. This shouldn't be a conversation we're even having today. We ought to just get beyond it, get a deal, and move on. It's a waste of time and energy.
Well, I want to thank each of the panelists for pulling absolutely no punches. I know it's after lunch. We didn't want to destroy your appetites, but this is the reality we're facing. And I think it's up to each and every one of us who cares about the defense of this country, not just over the next 6 months, but for the foreseeable future, to keep pounding on our legislators and to tell them that defense is not meant to be collateral damage if we don't want our country to be damaged. Thank you very much.